Well, in addition to this book with Katarzyna, I know that you have a podcast, or you've been working on a podcast with her, and that it will be coming out soon at the time we're recording this. Maybe by the time this comes out, the first episode or so will have been released. But I'd like to hear more about what the show is you've been working on.
Yes, well, the show is actually called Lives Well Lived. So, what we were just talking about, that a life of counting blades of grass is not a life well lived, is relevant to it. We are both interested in this question of what it is to live well. And so, we have our own views on it. But in the podcast, the point is not just to develop theories and to argue for particular theories of that, but rather to have a series of interesting guests tell us about their lives and tell us about whether they think they've lived well and in what way they've lived well, or maybe mistakes that they've made, things that they regret, and allow our listeners to draw their own conclusions about that, while hopefully listening to people telling us interesting stories about their lives. So we are, the first episode is coming out on May the 16th, which may, as you say, be past by the time this goes to air. But we'll continue to be releasing them on Thursdays I think we'll take a pause maybe in July or August, but certainly throughout the rest of May and June, and maybe a bit into July. And then we'll be back in the second half of the year. And we have already done a number of interviews. One interview that we were very fortunate to get was, I think, the last recorded conversation intended for the public by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate psychologist. Well, the Nobel Prize he got was in economics, but he was a psychologist. And so that will probably be the next one that we release. Well, we're doing a first introductory one, and then after that, we will release the one with Daniel Kahneman. We have also done an interview with Robert Wright. Bob Wright's written books about one. I first came across him through a book called The Moral Animal, which is about the origins of morality looked at through an evolutionary perspective. And we talk about that. He also wrote a book called Non-Zero about the way in which he thinks human history works in a non-zero direction. In other words, he thinks, although there are certainly some zero-sum games that humans are involved in, he thinks there's more a tendency towards things that are non-zero, beneficial of both. So we talk about that and whether history has a direction. And then he wrote a book called Why Buddhism is True. He's talking about Buddhist psychology rather than some of the beliefs of Buddhism. Like, he's not saying reincarnation is necessarily true. But we talk about Buddhist psychology with Wright. We have an interview with the singer Judy Collins, who people my age will remember as having the most beautiful voice and having sung protest songs and folk songs, and being a songwriter as well. I think she's a wonderful singer. She's turning 85 this month, but she's got a lot of stories about her life and about the life well lived. We are interviewing Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist, science popularizer, and we'll talk to him about his life. We have an interview with Dewey Toledo, who is a Brazilian kind of self-made entrepreneur, growing up in a household that had no books at all in it, but educating, and neither of his parents completed elementary school, but he's basically educated himself and has an interesting set of rules for living by. So those are some of the people that we'll have in the first month or two of the podcast.
Well, that's a pretty excellent lineup. I had Kahneman on my show as well, and I always refer to him as Danny because that is how he asks to be called, and I get made fun of in the comments for once saying like Danny and I as if we're best friends. But when you're interviewing people like Kahneman, for instance, on your show, are you also going to be talking to them about sort of the content of their career, or in his case, his academic output, or is it more just about his life separate from his research?
No, we do talk about his academic production. Certainly, I think that's important for people to understand if they're assessing his life. So we talk about prospect theory, which he, of course, acknowledges that is a collaborative project he did with Amos Tversky, who certainly would have shared the Nobel Prize had he still been alive at the time that the prize was awarded. We also do talk, though, I mean, because in let's call him Danny, he was my colleague at Princeton, so I think I can do that, hopefully, without getting too many snide comments. So he was very interested in happiness as well. And after doing the prospect theory stuff, he started doing things about trying to measure happiness and what are the factors that contribute to happiness. For example, he got people to program their mobile phones in a certain way so that he would randomly ring them, or he'd set something up to randomly ring their phones. And essentially that would give them a scale from 1 to 10, which they could hit on as to how positive their current state of mind is. You know, are they extremely happy? Then hit 10. Are they miserable? Then hit 1 or 0, and somewhere in between. And then also say what you're doing right now. So he found, for example, that if you're commuting, you're probably fairly low on that scale. If you're with someone you love, you're likely to be much higher. So he did all of that kind of research. And that's so in his situation, both his academic output and his assessment of his own life were relevant to the theme of lives well lived and how to live well.